From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Congress scrambles on a government spending bill, with Republican leaders in the Senate and the House diverging on the right strategy. Welcome, I'm Kyle Peterson with the Wall Street Journal. We are joined today by my colleagues, columnist Kim Strassel and editorial board member Kate Batchelder-Odell. The deadline to fund the government is December 16th. That's Friday, 2 days from now as we record this, and still it seems like the ball is up in the air. The latest is a reported framework for an omnibus spending package, something on the order of $1.7 trillion. And here's Mitch McConnell making the argument for doing that at a press conference on Tuesday.
I think we're very close to getting an omnibus appropriation bill that would be, I think, broadly appealing. It would meet the defense number of the NDAA without having to pay a bonus above what President Biden asked for domestic priorities of the Democrats.
Kim, what's your read of where this stands and what is likely to happen here in the coming days?
So it does sound as though they have reached a broad agreement by which that would be the top two appropriators in the Senate, Richard Shelby and Patrick Leahy, and then the Democratic appropriator in the House, Rosa DeLauro. Interestingly, the Republican top appropriator, Kay Granger, is not taken part in any of these discussions because Kevin McCarthy, the incoming speaker, well, we think, does not support doing this omnibus bill. But those other major players, and including McConnell and Schumer, look as though they're on board. What the Republicans have been demanding from the start is that domestic discretionary spending doesn't come in above $1.65 trillion, which is what Biden had requested. For a while, Democrats were looking to make that number higher. They wanted to maintain what you call parity. They wanted to have at least the same amount of non-defense discretionary spending as defense discretionary spending. Republicans have been trying to break that link, as it were, which has been a demand that's been going on for years and has really pushed up spending. So for them to have gotten agreement, one of two things had to have happened. Either Democrats had to have stepped back from their demands for parity, or everyone is going to go ahead and they're just going to mask all the spending with a bunch of budget gimmicks, which is what I think is going to happen in the end.
We don't have all the details of this purported agreement on the framework yet, but a few of them are trickling out. And one that I think is worth highlighting is the defense spending number. As Mitch McConnell said, they're talking about $858 billion for defense, which matches the figure in the NDAA bill, the National Defense Authorization Act. And Kate, we talked about that in a podcast, I think, last week, and that's an 8% boost over previous figures. And you said that it was great to have that going through authorization, but don't forget that they also need to appropriate the money for it. And so what do you make of the fact that part of this deal would be hitting that target right on the nose?
Yeah, just to underscore Kim's point, the chokehold that parity has had on the appropriations process has been significant for several years. So while I'm still expecting a really ugly bill here, and it comes with the huge caveat that Democrats already spent trillions of dollars on domestic priorities through COVID bills and infrastructure packages, it would be one cheer worth of an improvement to have broken some level of parity where every marginal dollar you spend on the military, you have to match it with domestic spending on Head Start or something else. I do think it would be a welcome sign if the $858 billion defense authorization was matched with an appropriation. That's about an 8% increase over 22 levels. Unfortunately, that is really only the rate of inflation at this point, but it would at least keep the Pentagon from sinking further. It also would be a welcome development if the Pentagon could get a full year budget instead of an extended period of continuing resolutions, which are stopgap measures, and keep them from being able to kind of start on new projects, to fund maintenance accounts. I think having an on-time appropriation or relatively on-time appropriation would be just as helpful as the increase at this point. So I think you do have to count it as a big development for Congress to be saying that the Biden budget request for the Defense Department is insufficient. We are going to plus it up, and we are not going to be taken hostage by every additional dollar for domestic spending. But that said, to Kim's point, I still think the bill is going to be pretty ugly and will be that way as long as Congress continues to use this terrible omnibus process instead of passing the 12 underlying appropriations bills and doing regular order.
There still seems to be some jockeying, though, about what might make it into this omnibus appropriations bill. And One point that Republicans want is some extensions of tax provisions. One in particular I would point out is the 100% bonus depreciation for investments that was in the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, the 2017 Trump tax bill, that begins to phase down after December 31st, 2022. And so next year it is 80%, then 2024 it's 60%, 2025 40%, 2026 20%. And so especially as we go into a time where it looks like the economy might be a little bit on the rocks, I think Republicans maybe want to get that depreciation extended. But at least Senator John Thune, the number 2 Senate Republican, is saying he's skeptical of that. Here's the quote from him. There's a lot of expiring tax policy that needs to be expended and which enjoys bipartisan support. But as usually is the case, there's a ransom to be paid when it comes to tax policy, and the price may be too high. But Kim, then he added, I don't see it, but it's Christmas season and anything can happen. So what do you make of this?
Right. So one last thing, though, just on what Kate was saying, I wholeheartedly agree that it's wonderful that the military is getting the boost in the money it needs. I really don't believe that, in fact, Republicans are breaking parity. As I mentioned, I think what's going to happen here is that Democrats are going to get all of the domestic discretionary dollars they want. It's just that people are going to hide it in different fashions to make it look as though they've broken parity, even though they haven't. That's how you end up with Mitch McConnell saying that this bill is going to be broadly appealing. A couple of ways you can see that happening, by the way, is taking a chunk of money, for instance, that would normally go to Veterans Affairs in the discretionary budget, but moving it over to the mandatory side so you don't have to claim it on the top line number, maybe using a supplemental for more spending for Afghanistan to poke some money in there and make the underlying bill, again, look as though you are having less domestic discretionary spending when in fact it's been put in other places. That is how I think this is going to get done. Sadly, I don't think that there's going to be any break in parity. I think that this is just going to be one big gimmick. But to your point, Kyle, about these expiring tax provisions, this has been a discussion that's been in the works for a while. The sticking point here is that these tax provisions that you mentioned have broad appeal on both sides of the aisle. And yet Democrats are asking that they be paired along with one of their big asks, which is the renewal of an expanded child tax credit, which is much more costly than these tax breaks would be. Republicans are under a lot of pressure because the business community is lobbying hard for this. And there are a couple of other small tax provisions that people would like to see extended too, some retirement tax incentives, some delay of some reporting requirements that are about to kick in on tax reporting for gig workers. But again, that's what Thune was mentioning, is this could be too high of a price if they have to go along with the child tax credit. And that's why all of this is potentially unlikely to happen.
On the point about the child tax credit, though, some interesting news in recent days is that the White House, President Biden, is apparently ready to try to cut a deal on that and include work requirements in the child tax credit program. This has been a sticking point, particularly for Democratic Senator Joe Manchin. He wants programs to include work requirements, to include means testing, so they're focused on people who need the help. And Kate, do you think this changes any of the dynamic in these negotiations, the White House's new openness on this work requirement question?
Kyle, I think it's important to talk about what a work requirement in this case means. There's a lot of confusion. What the child tax credit has traditionally had is basically a very low income requirement. It's not a requirement that you have a job for 40 hours a week or anything like that. It is basically $2,500 of earned income a year. And that is when the credit starts to kick in. And as you work additional hours, the credit gets more generous until it gets all the way fully phased in, is what it's called. The point of this rigmarole is to basically reward people for working extra and try to use it as some sort of path to upward mobility. We've had a lot of problems with this use of the child tax credit, but it was a big improvement over what Democrats want to do, which is basically require no income of any kind and give the full benefit to any household, regardless of their income status. So that is what we're talking about when we are talking about a work requirement. And the Congress has over the years just made that income requirement lower and lower. Democrats want it to be zero. Basically, Democrats are going to try to maximize how many people they can get receiving the full credit. Right now, the credit is worth $2,000. But there are other questions here too, Kyle. The $2,000 credit, for instance, doesn't start to phase out until $400,000 for married couples. That is a tax benefit for exceedingly wealthy people in America. So there's more than one question here about who gets the child tax credit and how does it function. I am hopeful that there is no path to a deal for a child tax credit because it is so expensive. And I don't know if 10 Republicans can go along with what the White House really wants to do, which is use it as an engine of social spending to households that do not work very much or don't have a worker in them. So I'm hopeful that there's no path forward there. And I think it's a little cynical here to try to use the tax extenders. Some of these tax provisions are broadly popular to something that Democrats have repeatedly failed to pass. So hopefully it will fall down here and collapse on its own weight.